Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa wala. Sorry about the delay, inshallah. We'll add about 5 minutes for the rest of this section, inshallah, because it's a very important hot topic, and want to give the topic its fair due. We will bring back Ustadha Zaynab Ansari for the next lecture on a hadith regarding women, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه تسليما اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما آمين يا رب. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Inshallah, the topic that we're going to address really is one that would require a lot more time, but I'm going to try my best within the time constraints. And I have to say, I just really want to appreciate my gratitude to the organizers. It's a very well thought out knowledge retreat with some really serious subject matter. So, any one of these topics, honestly, we could have taken Mustalah al-Hadith, we could have taken a subset of terminology, we could have taken some of these issues of pluralism, gender, science and hadith, and any one of these could have actually been the entire focus of the weekend. So I just want to encourage everybody that our main niyyah in being here should be not necessarily that we get every single question answered, but I think the main intention in being here is kind of having fresh perspectives, renewing our resolve as confident Muslims, and having the tools to begin to address the questions and doubts that we might have, or to be able to kind of use those tools to help others, whether it's in the field of da'wah, education, or really just kind of answering the questions that even our own kids might bring to us. So just wanted to mention that. And then the other thing that I want us to understand here, there have been some questions about statements I made regarding pre-modern Muslims, and do they kind of deal with doubts and misgivings and questions. And what I really want you all to understand is that the subject matter of women in the hadith, I think, is one that would maybe kind of help us to understand what I'm getting at, because I'm very strongly convinced that with the encounter of Islam and modernity, and with the psychological defeat that many Muslims experienced, I think one of the manifestations of which is just this constant kind of apologetics for Islam, I really think there's a very qualitative difference between how we engage our faith today and the experience of pre-modern Muslims. And I think these case studies of women in hadith are really illustrative of that point. Raise your hand if you've heard of the muhaddithat, for example. Raise your hand if you've heard of the muhaddithat. So who's raising their hand? I don't see that a lot of hands are going up. So let's try that one more time. So raise your hand if you know what the term muhaddithat is or means. Not a lot of hands are being raised. Okay, so for those of you that are raising your hands, I appreciate that. So quickly, a volunteer, what do I mean by muhaddithat? That corner over there. Somebody raise their hand. Muhaddithat. Yes, you, brother. All right, excellent. Thank you, brother. So, yes, so Dr. Tasneem mentioned that. So the muhaddithat, this is a book about women hadith narrators or hadith scholars. But what's really interesting to me is that it's not just the idea of, okay, we've got these women that are hadith narrators or hadith scholars. What I want you to understand is this fact. These aren't women that are just mindlessly regurgitating a hadith they heard, and that's the end of the story. That in being a muhadditha, in being a hadith transmitter, narrator, or I really prefer the term scholar, because these women were scholars in their own right, that certainly they had to engage with questions around women in the hadith. It's impossible for someone to have been a muhadditha, especially some of the top muhaddithat, the muhaddithat who had really kind of renown all throughout the Muslim world, muhaddithat that counted amongst their own students some of the most prominent male scholars, it's impossible for a woman to have reached that level of scholarship in a work like Sahih al-Bukhari, for example, and not have encountered the hadith that you're going to see in front of you. So this is what I want you all to understand. I'm not dismissing questions that we might have. I'm not saying those questions are unimportant. I'm not saying those questions are not relevant. But what I'm saying here is just consider this fact that for 1400 years, because really you had muhaddithat in every generation and every century, those numbers might have declined somewhat with the advent of modernity. But in reality, there's not been a single historical era where you didn't have women scholars of Sharia and Islamic studies and Hadith. So what I want you all to consider is that for 1400 years, you had women that were certainly teaching these ahadith. And they continued to teach them. They continued to think about them. They continued to apply the lessons they gained from the ahadith and the reverence that they had for the sunnah in their daily lives and in their interactions with their students. So the question that I have for you, my dear sisters and my dear brothers, is why we as modern or postmodern people have become so fixated on this idea of some kind of misogyny embedded in the hadith. The muhaddithat were intelligent, capable, competent women. And I think that when we get fixated on this idea, well, the hadith are just misogynistic, we really do a disservice to, again, a 1400-year, fairly uninterrupted tradition of women actually teaching these very ahadith that we view as misogynistic. So what are we going to say? Well, what does that say about those women? Does it say that they were, experiencing cognitive dissonance? They didn't understand the subject matter? That somehow they had internalized their own oppression? You all see what I'm getting at here? I think it's very problematic when we take a hadith like this one and we're going to use this hadith as kind of our sole pathway of understanding women and women's worth in the sight of God. So that's my preface for what I'm going to do, inshallah, in the next 30 minutes or so. And the muhaddithat, I really wish every hand had gone up here because this is something that is part of our tradition. I.e., this is something that's part of Islam's kind of, this is part of our intellectual legacy, heritage. So it's not just some kind of curious fact that Dr. Muhammad Akram Nadwi unearths and that's the end of the story. There is the introduction that he translated some years back called Muhaddithat, the Women Scholars of Islam, but in reality this is more than one book. It's about 40 volumes now from what I understand. So if you want to look up this project, you want to look up Dr. or Sheikh Muhammad Akram Nadwi. He's at Cambridge Muslim College. And again, now it's a 40-volume series on women whose expertise was in hadith studies. But keep in mind that it's not just they knew about hadith, they also understood other areas of Islamic sciences. So when we use the term muhaddithat, we want to be able to use terms like muhaddithat and really think of these women and their contribution as being on the level of the other scholars whose work we naturally celebrate or venerate. So the hadith that I have in front of you that I really want to focus on, because I was given a few different hadith to look at for this session, and there's one hadith in particular that we're going to focus on. And the first thing that I want you all to see in terms of this hadith and where it's located is that this hadith is located in Sahih al-Bukhari, but the chapter where it's located. So I've selected a hadith that probably amongst the hadith about women is probably one of the most, if not the most controversial. And as you can see right here, the heading is really important. And understand this, you have the biography of Imam al-Bukhari, I think earlier this morning with Sheikh Sulaiman. Imam al-Bukhari is not somebody that is going to sort of randomly arrange his book. In other words, he has a methodology and a criteria for how he organizes the ahadith. So if you actually want to find this hadith that sadly many of us have taken to be the sum total of Islam's stance on women and gender, we are not going to open up Sahih al-Bukhari and find a chapter that Imam al-Bukhari has basically entitled Status of Women in Islam. You actually have to go to the let's go to Sahih Bukhari table of contents. You actually have to go to the book on menstrual periods, Kitab al-Hayd. So right off the bat, this should tell you something in terms of what is the actual significance of this hadith for Imam al-Bukhari himself. Again, this is the table of contents of Sahih Bukhari. And if you're looking through the table of contents and you're trying to find a chapter that's entitled, status or role of women in Islam, do you see such a chapter in Sahih Bukhari? No, you don't. But what you see is that right here, he's got a chapter called Kitab al-Hayd. And if we scroll down, you're going to see the hadith in question, which is right, let's see, it's a longer hadith and it should be right here. I saw it just a second ago. A little bit further down probably. Yeah, here it is. This one right here. Let me make it a little bigger. Let's see. Okay. So there's the hadith. Okay, Jazakallah khairah. And just, I'm going to come over here and just kind of look at it from my laptop if that's okay. So this is what I want you all to note about the hadith. Number one is its placement in Sahih Bukhari. The fiqh or basically jurisprudential ruling here, it's the fiqh ruling that I think is the most significant implication of the hadith. But let's go ahead and read it. حدثنا سعيد بن أبي مريم قال أخبرنا محمد بن جعفر قال أخبرني زيد هو ابن أسلم عن عياض بن عبد الله عن أبي سعيد الخدري رضي الله عنه قال خرج رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم في أضحى أو فطر إلى المصلى فمر على النساء فقال it should be معشر النساء تصدقنا. And I'm going to go ahead and go back to the website because the one that I've got in my slides here, it had inverted the Arabic. Okay, so يا معشر النساء تصدقنا فإني أريتكن أكثر أهل النار فقلنا وبما يا رسول الله قال تكثرن اللعنة وتكفرن العشير ما رأيت من ناقصات عقل ودين أذهب للب الرجل الحازم من إحداكن قلنا وما نقصان ديننا وعقلنا يا رسول الله قال أليس شهادة المرأة مثل نصف شهادة الرجل قلنا بلى قال فذلك من نقصان عقلها أليس إذا حاضت لم تصلي ولم تصم قلنا بلى قال فذلك من نقصان دينها. So that is the hadith. The translation obviously is right there. Everybody can see it. So let me say a few things about this hadith, inshallah, before I don't know how much time we have left. Okay, so I'm going to do the translation, inshallah, and then a couple of things before I kind of offer some comments. So the hadith is from Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, who said that once God's messenger, peace be upon him, went out to the musalla. So again, context clues here. It's quite time-bound, this one. He went out to the musalla to offer the prayer. Some say it was adha, some say it was fitr. Then he passed by the women and said, O women, ya ma'shar an-nisa, give alms to saddaqna, as I've seen. And the verb is interesting. Uritu kunna. I have seen that the majority of the dwellers of hellfire were you, women. And they asked, why is it so, O God's messenger? He replied, you curse frequently and are ungrateful to your husbands. I have not seen anyone more deficient. That's a translation, it's not the best one. I have not seen anyone more deficient in intelligence and religion than you. A cautious, sensible man could be led astray by some of you. The women asked, O Allah's messenger, what is deficient in our intelligence and religion? He said, is not the evidence of two women equal to the witness of one man? They replied in the affirmative. He said, this is the deficiency in her intelligence. Isn't it true that a woman can neither pray nor fast during her menstruation? The women replied in the affirmative. He said, this is the deficiency in her religion, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And as you can see, it's right there in Sahih Bukhari, and this is where it is. This is the placement of it. A couple of things, inshallah. I am going to actually come back to the hadith because there's some commentary that I have on this particular hadith. But there are a couple of things I want you all to keep in mind when you come across a hadith such as this one. And I chose this one on purpose because I think there's a lot going on in this particular hadith. First things first, when we look at a hadith such as this one in Sahih al-Bukhari, I want you all to consider the realm of hadith criticism. And that's why we're doing Mustalah al-Hadith over the retreat, over this weekend. Because what I want you all to understand is that for people that want to critique a hadith such as this one and argue that this hadith is indicative of sort of a deeper misogyny within the Islamic tradition, you have to understand that the hadith is in a Sahih collection. And we've learned about Imam al-Bukhari and about his methodology. Now we maybe understand a little bit about the ranking of a hadith in terms of authenticity. We know there's something called ilm al-rijal. We understand there's something called jarh wa ta'dil, where you evaluate the narrators. We understand that there are women who as muhaddithat played a very important role in shaping the field of hadith studies. Again, we have to take all of these things into consideration when we look at a hadith like this one and argue that, okay, maybe we should throw it out or whatever people want to do this particular hadith. So understand this, that the field of hadith criticism is not something that is somehow new. It's not something that pre-modern Muslims were unaware of. And textual criticism is not something that was sort of invented by Western scholars and then kind of imposed retroactively on the Islamic tradition. So when we look at a hadith like this and we read certain things into this hadith, I think it's very important for us to be really very self-aware and to ask ourselves, I want to see the audience on this side, to ask ourselves, why do we have the reaction that we do to this particular hadith? In other words, if we view the hadith as being unfair to women, do we view the hadith as being unfair to women on the basis of how the hadith is worded? Is it the language that's used? Is it the translation that we have in front of us? Is it maybe that this hadith we feel has been kind of weaponized by certain men perhaps against women? These are all things I invite us to think about as we consider the role of women in the hadith. And these are some assumptions. Again, these are assumptions about the hadith tradition that I think we might want to unpack. And this is really in the field of feminist criticism. And the first principle, if you will, again, the first assumption, if we apply feminist critique to the hadith, is an assumption of oppression. And we need to be very careful about this, all right? So I'm going to take these principles, and now I'm going to actually talk about the hadith, and let's try to kind of cross-reference here. If we look at this hadith and we say, okay, the hadith is somehow, it's misogynistic, it's unfair to women, what we are really doing is we are actually critiquing the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that's where we have to be very careful. Because really one of the central ideas of feminism is that women are inherently oppressed and are inherently victimized by the structures of patriarchy. What that means is that women are essentially victims of patriarchal structures that have basically subjugated women economically, politically, socially, and psychologically. And that this kind of patriarchal ideology has to be dismantled, and that really is at the heart of feminism. So again, we're taking an idea, and we're accepting this idea at face value that women are, again, sort of inherently being victimized by patriarchy. Then we see a hadith such as the one about women supposedly being kind of deficient in intelligence and religion. And then the second kind of assumption here that we see in feminist critique is that men are viewed as kind of being the norm and women are being viewed as other than that. That women by their very nature are being marginalized, and that women by their very nature are viewed as somehow different and other than and less than men. And again, that is a reading that people have done of this hadith, because in the hadith, the Prophet, peace be upon him, mentions certain kind of biological experiences that women have. Then another feminist assumption that, and this is, as Muslims, we need to be extremely careful. And please understand this, I'm not endorsing these positions. I'm just trying to convey to you what I think is part of the problem in terms of how we are reading this hadith. Whether we are directly being influenced by these ideas, or I think a lot of us have really kind of subconsciously internalized these ideas because we are products of our environment, of our culture. So another kind of component of feminist critique is that all of Western civilization is deeply rooted in patriarchy. And by extension, they basically are saying Judeo-Christian religion itself cannot be separated from patriarchal ideology. And the example they give is how Eve is blamed, Hawa is blamed for the fall of man from paradise and as being the source of original sin. Again, this is an idea that is definitely deeply embedded in Christianity. Another aspect of this critique is that feminist activity has to have as its objective to change the world by promoting full-on gender equality. And again, this is why the subject matter becomes so thorny for Muslims. Because if you survey Islamic law, you are going to see that the impulse that sort of is at the center of Islamic law is not necessarily the full-on equality of the sexes, but the emphasis really is far more on equity than equality. And then another kind of assumption here that's part of feminist critique here is that gender issues play a part in every aspect of the human experience, whether we are consciously aware of these issues or not. And that's not something that I would necessarily push back on. I think some of these observations are valid, but what I'm very concerned about is when we take a hadith like this one in Sahih Bukhari, Kitab al-Hayd, and we read it in terms of patriarchy, in terms of we have to dismantle patriarchal assumptions, in terms of the hadith is making a statement about the equality or lack thereof of men and women, and in terms of the takeaways we might have about the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So I wanted to counter some of those aspects of feminist critique by reminding us that there are requirements, really. There are kind of criteria for doing criticism of texts within the Islamic tradition. And let me share these points with you. And I've got, basically, these are 8 points here. And these points are in the excellent book by Muhammad Zubair Siddiqui on hadith literature. Okay, it's not there on the screen in front of you. If you'd like a copy of these notes, just come and speak to me afterwards, inshallah. But these are principles that Islamic scholars themselves have applied to textual criticism. And the first one is that the tradition that we're examining must not be contrary to other traditions which have been accepted by authorities on the subject as authentic and reliable. So when you take a hadith like the one that we have in front of us, the first thing you have to do is to see if there is some kind of innate contradiction between this hadith and others that have been accepted by authorities as being reliable. The tradition should also not go against the Quran or a mutawatir hadith, for example, that is a hadith that's mass transmitted, or ijma' qat'i, which is basically decisive, absolute consensus of the scholars or basic principles of Islam. So again, what you are doing is you are going to take this hadith and you're going to read it in light of what does the Quran actually say about women and women's status and women's kind of equality vis-a-vis men. What do other ahadith that are similar say on the subject matter? What is the consensus of scholars, for example, on this topic? And by the way, the scholars never arrived at any consensus that somehow women were innately inferior to men. To the contrary, there's actually quite a bit of debate about what the nuqsan in the hadith is actually relating to. Another thing, and this is something that I think that was mentioned by one of our dear teachers yesterday, or maybe it'll come back today. I was reviewing the notes. I know someone has talked about this. But also that there's a red flag if you have a hadith, for example, that maybe disproportionately attaches a high reward for a very small deed, and then it mentions a really harsh punishment for an ordinary sin, that normally such a hadith have to be rejected. Traditions also extolling the virtues of certain portions of the Quran may not be authentic. This is another thing too. There are a lot of ahadith in circulation that tell you about the merits of reading such and such surah. Not all those hadith are authentic. Some are and some aren't. So again, I'm just giving you some of the principles of Islamic textual criticism. Also, sometimes if there are ahadith that praise the superiority of certain persons, tribes, and particular places, we have to be careful about those ahadith because often they have been invented to support a particular political agenda. Now, ahadith that contain detailed prophecies, we have to be careful with those too because some are authentic because, again, the role of a prophet is to also predict things. However, if it is attached to a specific date, that can be a red flag that that hadith is not authentic. And another principle, a matan, the text of the hadith should not violate the basic rules of Arabic grammar or style. In other words, we have to be confident that the Prophet, peace be upon him, has actually expressed himself this way using these terms. And the final point, which I really want to highlight here, is that traditions containing such remarks of the Prophet as may not be a part of his prophetic vocation, or such expressions are clearly unsuitable for him should be rejected. I'll read that again. Traditions that contain remarks that purportedly are ascribed to the Prophet, peace be upon him, but are not really a proper part of his prophetic vocation, i.e. they seem to conflict with his mission. Or traditions that have language that is just clearly unsuitable for the Prophet, peace be upon him, must be rejected according to this scholar. So now that we have, I've gone through some of these principles, let's actually go back to this particular hadith. And there are a few things that stand out. Okay, can we get the hadith? Okay, so there are a few things that stand out to me about this particular hadith. One is that the Prophet ﷺ is not basically summoning all the women of Medina and saying that he's going to make a pronouncement on the status of women in Islam. You have to understand that there's something very kind of time-bound that's happening here. He's on his way to the Musalla. He passes by a group of women, and he gives these women nasiha. So we're going to stop right there. You have to understand this is something that is not out of character for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In fact, one of the things that he was accustomed to doing is that he would actually set aside a day where he would just focus on answering the questions of the women in the community and instructing them. And you have to also understand another thing about the hadith, that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, did not do as much formal instruction as we assume. We assume that he spent a lot of time engaged in durus and halaqat, i.e. in some kind of formal exchange of information and knowledge with the companions. Most of the prophetic tarbiyah tended to take place in more common, relaxed, casual, day-to-day interactions. So I want you all to keep that in mind. And I think the challenge when we come across a hadith like this is that, remember, this is a data point amongst many thousands, tens of thousands, and hundreds of thousands of data points that we call the ahadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So if you have this kind of snapshot, understand it's just a snapshot of advice he gave to a particular group of women on that day at that time. And it is not necessarily indicative of his overall views, peace be upon him, about women in totality. I'll give you all an example that maybe I think we can relate to. And you have probably had this experience. If you walk into a room and you find people in that room deeply engaged in conversation on some very kind of controversial issue or some thought-provoking topic, and you only hear kind of part of the conversation. In other words, you don't have access to the full conversation. You don't know the conversations that maybe led up to that. You don't really know what dialogue was happening in the background. You don't know what is the context of these two individuals. You don't know what their relationship was prior to that. In other words, you have to understand with the ahadith that we are getting snapshots of an ongoing dialogue between the Prophet ﷺ and his community from the earliest days in Mecca, 13 years, all the way through his 10 years in Medina sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So what you really have to do is we have to be better kind of detectives in this. We have to do a little bit more forensic work, to use that term, to really understand what the Prophet actually thought about women and their contribution sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So remember, it's time bound. You're only getting one small piece of that conversation. And I guarantee you that around this time in Medina, there were likely ongoing conversations about women and about men and about the merits of each group and what reward they could expect to have in the hereafter. And the reason why I'm saying this is because in other commentaries, especially when we look at the first section of the hadith where the Prophet says, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, let's look at the Arabic, فَإِنِّي أُرِيتُكُنَّ أَكْثَرَ أَهْلِ النَّارِ. This actually comes from something that's happening in Medina. And what's happening is that, again, you have groups of men and women engaged in discussion regarding whose numbers are going to be greater in paradise. What will the reward look in the akhirah? So remember, what we have here in the hadith is just one particular kind of like intervention into this conversation. And if our takeaway from this hadith is that for all times, that the majority of the dwellers of hellfire are women, I think it is a gross misreading of this hadith. Because remember what the Prophet does as a prophet. He's given a certain window into alam al-ghayb, or the world of the unseen. So it may be that at a particular moment, the Prophet is shown things about the dwellers of paradise, the dwellers of hellfire. And in that moment, he goes to people who he thinks might be impacted by that, and he gives them advice about that. And that's how I've always understood this particular hadith. This is not the messenger of God making a pronouncement that women, by virtue of being women, are going to be the gender that predominates in hellfire. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, is that what he was shown in that particular moment about people's realities in the barzakh would indicate that in that particular moment that he saw a great number of those dwellers of hellfire were women. Again, in the commentaries, they counter this by saying that this has several things that we can actually think about logically in terms of, well, how do we know the numbers of people at all in the akhirah? If the assumption is that women naturally outnumber men, then this makes logical sense. Another observation in the commentaries about this is that we know that in the akhirah there's kind of like a plethora of azwaj mutahhara, of purified spouses. This is something that the Quran mentions. The Quran mentions the idea of these maidens. For example, Surah Al-Rahman, chapter 55 is an example of that. There are ahadith where the Prophet discusses the wives that a man will have in paradise, etc., etc. So really what we're getting when we put these traditions together is that there is an abundance really of both genders, with women especially kind of being in multiplicity in the akhirah. And that's how we have to understand this particular hadith. Another point, and how are we doing for time? Just let me know. We have? Okay, good. Okay, inshallah. So, because I want to make sure we can take some questions as well. Another point about this particular hadith is that this is very much a commentary on behavior as opposed to reducing people to some kind of, kind of like immutable sort of fixed essence. In other words, the Prophet is not saying that women are this way because they are women. It would be analogous to saying that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, engaged in certain kind of skirmishes or campaigns with the Jews in Medina because they were Jewish. Would we accept that premise? Do we accept the premise that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala issues these rebukes in the Quran to Bani Israel because of their Jewishness? Would we say that? I would like to think we would not accept that premise. They are critiqued because of their behavior, Bani Israel, because of their rejection of prophets and messengers, because of the way they dealt with Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam. So I want us to understand a hadith about women in the same light. Again, they are not being critiqued because of their essential biology, because of things they can't help, but this is very much about behavior. So that if the Prophet, peace be upon him, is commenting on behavior such as cursing or complaining or being ungrateful to spouses. And look at the term here. The term is quite interesting. It says, تُكْثِرْنَ اللَّعْنَ وَتَكْفُرْنَ وَتَكْفُرْنَ الْعَشِيرَ. So the term that's actually used here is, and this is an accurate translation, it means that they're given over to speech, which is just basically kind of like harsh speech. It's not becoming. And see, what the Prophet is saying here, peace be upon him, is that he wants better for the women than what he's seeing. And it's not beyond the realm of possibility that you had some women in Medina who at that time were engaging in that type of conduct. And for women that get upset by this hadith, I have to tell you this, my dear sisters, as a woman, I have lost count how many times a woman has come along and basically lambasted her husband for everything under the sun as if the man never, ever, ever did a good thing for her in one day of his life. I've seen that time and time again. I've also seen it from men as well. In fact, I think probably one of the main maladies of marriage today is the fact that you have two people who often cannot remember a single good thing the other one did for them, but they remember all of the bad things. So this is what the hadith is getting at here. The Prophet is attempting to forestall behaviors that could ultimately end up being very injurious to marriage, to the bedrock of that community. And remember, just because the Prophet alerts us to a behavior, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is engaging in that behavior. A lot of the ahadith, if you actually pay attention to the wording, are ahadith that are kind of predictive. In other words, they tell you these are the things that you should not be doing. Doesn't mean that everybody is this way, but these are the things that you need to be avoiding. Then another interesting aspect of the hadith here is that the Prophet ﷺ says right here, مَا رَأَيْتُ مِنْ نَاقِصَاتِ عَقْلٍ وَدِينٍ أَذْهَبَ لِلُبِّ الرَّجُلِ الْحَازِمِ مِنْ إِحْدَاكُنَّ. This is a really interesting statement that I think has so many layers that have to be unpacked. And, time does not really allow me to do this, but right here in the wording of this naqisat, and let's look at the translation here. I have not seen anyone more deficient in intelligence and religion than you. Deficient is a really poor translation. And I think probably my number one concern about mistranslations of a hadith is that people will take a hadith like this, they'll take language like the language of nuqsan, then they'll use this language to basically, kind of like apply that as an interpretive lens for all of Islamic law dealing with gender differences, and that is a mistake. So what the Prophet is getting at here, what he's getting at alayhi salatu wasalam, is really, it's two things. It's the general and the specific. In terms of the kind of the specifics of this, he actually mentions specifically why he's using this language, because the women actually ask him this. And again, if he was intending to demean these women, God forbid, would he have engaged in this dialogue, in this back and forth, where they're actually asking him why he's saying this? So the far more appropriate translation is that there's a reduction, that there is a reduction that's basically allowed in terms of women's obligations in certain aspects of Islamic law. That's really what this is about. That there's a lightening of the load, that women are not going to be as encumbered by certain responsibilities as men. For example, when it comes to the realm of witnessing. And by the way, if you've studied that issue under Islamic law, you know it's not a blanket rule necessarily that every time you have a female witness that she has to be corroborated by another female witness to reach the level of the witness of a single male. All right, you have to understand this, or an individual male. The other point here is that when it comes to these biological processes, when it comes to menstruation, and when it comes to, again, the fact that, and look at the heading here, this is really this was the main takeaway for Imam al-Bukhari, extremely specific. This was not some general universal principle on men and women in Islam, but for him, this was the hukum, this was the ruling that menstruating women, the obligation of fasting is lifted from them. So again, the nuqsan here is much more a reduction in terms of these women's legal and ritual obligations. So the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, again, he's mentioning something very specific here. He's giving specific rulings regarding women and that lifting of obligation here. And then the Prophet is also speaking in more general terms here. When he says, when he mentions this idea of a cautious, sensible man being led astray by some of you. So what does this mean? What it doesn't mean, let me talk about this part first. It does not mean that the Prophet is somehow casting all women as, I don't know, irresponsible, wayward, seductive temptresses, enticing men from their responsibilities and duties and what have you. That is a misreading of the hadith. However, I think what might be more appropriate here is to understand that in the realm of marriage, because really that's really what the hadith is really kind of connected to, kind of indirectly, that in the realm of marriage, that really for both the male and the female, they have to balance a certain level of resolve, of decisiveness, of kind of like being rational against the very emotional and intimate nature of that relationship. And if you actually look at ayahs in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually tells us that verily your wealth and your children can be what for you? A test, a fitna for you. And this is something that I want you all to understand, that when it comes to these interpersonal relationships, that often in trying to balance between rights and responsibilities, sometimes it's very easy to kind of fall on one side or another. And in this hadith, the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, is telling us to strive for that balance as much as is humanly possible. Right? He's not talking about sort of the archetypal male kind of being rational and reasonable and women being the opposite of that. That is not what he is getting at all. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So the takeaway, because again, this is I think this is probably one of the hardest topics that was assigned, so please forgive me for my shortcomings in being able to address this. Normally, I take probably a full weekend just to focus on this issue alone. But I think the main takeaway that I would offer to everybody here is that, religiously speaking, you do not have an obligation to be able to analyze every single hadith in order to love the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. That is very important. And if you read a hadith such as this one and it stirs up certain emotions, that's okay. And what you do is you take those emotions to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and ask Allah to give you clarity. And you have to understand that what you have in this hadith is a snapshot from one momentary conversation between the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the women in Medina, and on that particular day. It's not a universal statement of gender in Islam. So I think with that, inshallah, let's see if we have any questions. We probably have, a couple of questions I would imagine that have come in. Okay.
So, could this hadith be taken as an example of hyperbole?
Yes, like many ahadith, it's meant to make us sit up and pay attention. As I mentioned the other day, it's the Prophet's role to tell us basically what we need to hear, not what we always want to hear.
You answered. Let's go with that. Are we required then to support or agree with every single hadith we hear? I'm not asking about credibility.
Theologically speaking, I think that we're on dangerous ground if we try to throw out a hadith that are in Sahih al-Bukhari. But do we have to agree with every single hadith from an aqidah perspective? No, I don't think we do, but it really depends upon the subject matter of the hadith. If the hadith is about fundamentals, then be extremely careful with that, i.e. that which is necessarily known of the religion, al-ma'lum min ad-din bil-darura, then that is I think that's non-negotiable. But if it's about kind of more tertiary or secondary matters, I think it could be open for some debate.
So let me ask you this, because, and I mentioned this yesterday, that sometimes it seems like we just came up with these sort of thoughts this past century. Did women before us, a few hundred years ago, 1,000 years ago, did they have similar questions? Like, did they bring these issues up?
Yes, they did have similar questions. I don't know that they necessarily had a lot of questions around this particular hadith, because again, if you study the stories of the muhaddithat, you find they're experts in Sahih al-Bukhari, for example, but you don't get a sense that they spent a lot of time, and if they left anything, we don't really know at this point. I'd have to do further research. I don't know that they left a lot of thoughts necessarily or commentary about this particular hadith. But did they have questions? Yes, they did. And those questions go back to the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. I did not have enough time to present this, but Salama is very very famous for asking questions about women and gender in Islam. And there are 3 ayahs in the Quran that come down in reference to her question, because she basically asks, are men more important than women in the sight of God, is her question. Yeah.
What was the response?
I'm sorry?
So what was the response?
The response was the Prophet basically listened to her, and he told her to wait, and he came back with revelation. One ayah actually comes down on the minbar, and it's 33-35. All right? So there are, Salama is one of the women, and Waraqa, Nusayba bint Ka'ab. Several women are actually asking questions, but largely Salama is credited with that question. And it's a really powerful question about men being mentioned versus women in the Quran. And 3 ayahs come down, 33-35, 3-195, and 4-32. All come down about Salama radiallahu ta'ala anha.
So, when we read a hadith like this, then how do we know that, like, it comes off as an overgeneralization to some people when they read it? So what do we do then with that, with feeling that this seems like a generalization about all women?
As I mentioned, I think to be self-aware enough to understand that there are some hadith that are meant to be universally applied, and others that are very specific and very time-bound. And you have to, like I said, balance this snapshot against the entire trajectory of the prophetic seerah. And you're going to see time and time again, he relies on women who he clearly trusts as being fully capable and competent. You don't get any sense that he thinks that women are somehow deficient or inferior. So that's what I would say. Don't make the mistake of universalizing one little mosaic or one little puzzle piece, then you ignore the entire trajectory of the seerah of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. You have to have a holistic reading.
Okay. So is the meaning then that there will be more women, that he sees more women in hell? Basically, is he saying that there are more women in hell and more women in heaven because of the numbers?
I think that's the most plausible reading. That, numerically speaking, we tend to outnumber men, so that's plausible. But I think here's the larger thing. To get caught up in issues such as, okay, more of this group versus that group, I think takes us away from the focus, which is how to get to the akhirah and how to get to Jannah in the first place. However, understand this, just because the Prophet is given a window into what's happening in the barzakh in that moment doesn't necessarily mean that that is fixed for the end of time. Do you understand that? That's what he saw in that particular moment, and he felt strongly enough about it to go and talk to the women in Medina.
Yeah. And in fact, Ibn Hajar, rahimahullah, he basically said the exact same thing. There's no problem here. It means that there's more women in general, so more in heaven, more in hell.
Yes,
that's
and
how he reconciles.
And thank you. Ibn Hajar and several scholars commented on that hadith because they themselves had questions. Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya and others actually wrote about that. They did not view women as being incompetent at all.
Are women allowed to be judges?
Yes. But it depends upon the madhab. Some madhahib have more leeway than others for allowing women to be judges. Some of them are going to restrict women to issues that concern women and children, and others have a more a broader view of that.
Are women allowed to be leaders or rulers, I should say?
Yes, again, subhanAllah, this was the toughest topic, because we're trying to address all the issues in our minds. And remember, the hadith of women, a country not prospering if a woman's in charge is one of those grossly misunderstood hadith. That's all I can say about that. I don't understand. I mean, people take that hadith to make arguments like, okay, a woman can't be in charge of her MSA. Honestly, some of it is just our own lack of common sense as Muslims, to be really honest with you.
Do you want to give the context of that?
Yeah, the context is the Persians had a lot of political turmoil. And in this particular hadith, the Prophet was commenting, peace upon him, on a woman that had succeeded her father to the reign of the Persian Empire. And that particular woman did not have a reputation for being somebody who was going to be fair and just. So it was very much a commentary on what was happening in Persia at that time, as opposed to a woman can never be in charge of anything for all times. Again, I think it does the Prophet it's disrespectful, frankly, when we ascribe to him attitudes that he did not have, sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Okay. All right. Jazakumullah khair. We're out of time, unfortunately, but we will go more.
Jazakallah khairan.